The rain lashed violently against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Crestview Executive Terminal. Inside the VIP departure lounge, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Emma, the 32-year-old billionaire CEO of Atheris Aviation, paced across the Italian marble floor, her heels clicking sharply like the ticking of a time bomb. She wore a flawless charcoal power suit, her phone pressed tightly to her ear, her face pale with suppressed rage. "I don't care about the crosswinds." Emma's voice sliced through the quiet luxury of the lounge, causing her two executive assistants to shrink back. "I have a board meeting in Denver in 3 hours that dictates the survival of this company. You tell the flight crew to prep the SX-800 prototype for immediate takeoff, or I will fire everyone in that hangar." Across the room, sitting quietly on a modest leather bench, was Daniel. He wore a faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots. His broad shoulders hunched slightly as he carefully wiped a smudge of chocolate off the face of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. They didn't belong in the VIP lounge. Daniel had only been allowed in because he was cashing in a favor from an old friend who worked ground control, trying to get his daughter home after a long, exhausting week. Daniel possessed a quiet, steady masculinity. His eyes, though tired and lined with the quiet grief of a man who had raised a child alone, took in the room with calculating precision. He didn't stare at Emma, but he noted her panicked breathing, the trembling of her hands as she lowered her phone, and the way her high-status world was rapidly unraveling. "Daddy," Lily whispered, tugging gently on Daniel's rough sleeve. She pointed a small finger toward the furious CEO. "That lady looks like she's going to cry." "Hush, sweetie," Daniel murmured, his voice a deep, soothing rumble. He adjusted the collar of Lily's worn denim jacket. "She's just having a hard day. We give people grace when they're having a hard day." Emma slammed her phone down onto a polished glass table, the loud crack echoing through the lounge. Her lead pilot had just refused to fly. The storm outside was intensifying, a massive squall line dragging dangerous wind shear across the runway. Without the prototype arriving in Denver, her hostile takeover defense would collapse. Her entire empire was slipping through her fingers. Blind with frustration, Emma turned sharply to storm toward the concierge desk and walked straight into Lily, who had wandered a few steps away to look at the rain. The impact sent the little girl stumbling backward. Lily gasped, dropping her small cup of hot cocoa, which splashed directly onto the pristine hem of Emma's charcoal trousers. The lounge went dead silent. Emma froze, her sharp eyes darting down to the brown stain ruining her $3,000 suit, then snapping up to glare at the little girl. The sheer stress of her crumbling empire boiled over into a moment of pure, misplaced arrogance. "Are you completely blind?" Emma snapped, her voice trembling with cold authority. She looked up, her gaze locking onto Daniel as he immediately stepped between her and his daughter. "Is this your child? What are you even doing in this terminal?" "This is a restricted executive lounge, not a public daycare." Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he shrink under the crushing weight of her billionaire intimidation. He simply knelt down, placing a large, protective hand on Lily's back to steady her. "I apologize for the spill, ma'am," Daniel said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It was the kind of calm that only belonged to men who had survived things far worse than a ruined suit. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and began wiping the cocoa from Lily's hands, completely ignoring Emma's outrage. "But you will not speak to my daughter in that tone." Emma stepped closer, her jaw tightening. She was used to men in suits cowering when she spoke. She was used to entire boardrooms falling silent. But the man in the faded jacket wasn't looking at her with fear. He was looking at her with quiet, undeniable authority. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Emma demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, her emotional walls hardening. "I own the aircraft parked outside. I am losing millions of dollars by the minute because of incompetent people, and I don't have the patience to deal with someone who clearly doesn't even belong in this building. Get out of my way." Before Daniel could respond, a frantic man in a high-visibility ground crew vest burst through the automatic doors of the lounge, completely ignoring protocol. His face was drenched in rain and panic. "Miss Emma," the man shouted, breathless. "It's the SX-800. The tie-downs snapped in the wind shear. The aircraft is drifting toward the fuel depot, and the auxiliary power unit is still running. If it sparks, the whole apron goes up." Emma's commanding presence instantly shattered. The cold, ruthless billionaire vanished, replaced by a woman staring at absolute destruction. She looked out the glass windows, her breath catching in her throat. Through the driving rain, her multi-million-dollar prototype aircraft was sliding dangerously across the slick tarmac, straight toward the highly flammable refueling station. "Call the fire department!" Emma screamed, her composure entirely broken. "Get someone out there!" "We can't," the crewman panicked. "The wind is too strong, and the manual override in the cockpit is locked." Panic erupted in the lounge. Emma's assistants began scrambling toward the exits. Emma herself stood frozen, her chest heaving, completely helpless as she watched everything she had built slide toward a catastrophic explosion. The power she wielded meant absolutely nothing against the brutal reality of the storm. Then, a heavy hand gently pushed past her. Daniel stood up. He unzipped his faded jacket, draping it carefully over Lily's shoulders. He knelt down one last time, looking his daughter directly in the eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, his hands moved with rapid, fluid precision, signing a message so quickly that Emma couldn't comprehend it. But Lily nodded, her small face trusting and completely unafraid. Daniel turned away from his daughter and walked directly toward the restricted tarmac doors. "Wait, what are you doing?" Emma yelled, her voice cracking with sudden desperation. "You can't go out there. You'll be killed." Daniel didn't even look back. He shoved the heavy storm doors open, stepping out into the roaring hurricane-force winds as if he had spent his entire life walking into the storm. The heavy acoustic doors of the VIP lounge sealed shut, instantly slicing off the violent roar of the storm. Inside, the silence was agonizing. Emma stood frozen, her hands pressed flat against the cold, rain-streaked glass, watching the man in the faded canvas jacket disappear into the gray, churning wall of rain. "He's going to die," whispered Julian Hayes, the panicked ground crew supervisor, his high-visibility vest dripping puddles onto the Italian marble floor. "The wind shear out there is tearing steel apart. He doesn't even have a safety tether." Emma didn't answer. Her breath hitched, fogging the glass. Outside, the SX-800 prototype, the crown jewel of Aetherius Aviation, an aircraft worth over $200 million, was groaning against the gale, its massive tires skidding inches at a time across the flooded tarmac. Just 50 yards away stood the main aviation fuel depot. If the plane's running auxiliary power unit made contact with those tanks, the resulting fireball would vaporize half the terminal. Her empire, her legacy, all of it was sliding toward absolute destruction, and all her billions, her ruthless boardroom tactics, and her sheer force of will were entirely useless. She had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly helpless. Behind her, Harrison Caldwell, her lead executive assistant, was frantically yelling into his cell phone. "I need emergency services at the Crestview apron right now. I don't care if the roads are flooded. I am authorizing a $5 million emergency retainer." Emma closed her eyes for a brief, agonizing second. Money. It was always their only weapon. And right now, it meant absolutely nothing. A soft sound pulled her attention away from the window. Emma turned. Amidst the chaos of screaming executives and frantic phone calls, 8-year-old Lily was sitting quietly on the leather bench. The little girl had meticulously folded her father's muddy handkerchief and placed it neatly beside her. She wasn't crying, she wasn't trembling. While the most powerful executives in the room were losing their minds, this child sat with a perfect, unwavering calm. Emma's chest tightened with a strange, unfamiliar ache. She walked slowly toward the bench, her ruined charcoal trousers forgotten. She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the little girl. Up close, Emma could see the faint dusting of freckles across Lily's nose, and the absolute certainty in her bright eyes. "Lily," Emma started, her voice shaking, stripping away every ounce of her usual commanding CEO persona. "Your father, he shouldn't be out there, it's too dangerous. Why didn't you stop him?" Lily looked at the beautiful, terrified woman and offered a small, gentle smile. It was a smile that carried far too much maturity for a child. "My dad doesn't let bad things happen," Lily said simply, her voice soft but entirely steady over the frantic background noise of the lounge. "He fixes things, especially when people are scared." "But he doesn't know anything about airplanes," Emma pleaded, desperation leaking into her tone. She didn't know why she was trying to convince the child. Perhaps she was just trying to convince herself. He's a civilian. He doesn't have the training." "You don't know my dad," Lily whispered, her gaze drifting back toward the raging storm outside. A loud crack of thunder rattled the floorboards, drawing Emma's terrified gaze back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the blinding sheets of rain, a flash of lightning illuminated the tarmac. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel wasn't just running blindly into the storm. He wasn't floundering like a civilian caught in a hurricane. As Emma watched, she realized his movements were completely deliberate. The wind was howling at over 70 miles per hour, yet Daniel moved with a low, tactical center of gravity. A heavy steel tie-down cable snapped free from the tarmac, whipping through the air like a lethal blade. Emma screamed, expecting to see him cut down. But Daniel didn't freeze. He anticipated the snap, dropping to his knees and letting the deadly cable whip harmlessly over his head before immediately pushing forward again. It was a reflex. It was muscle memory. It was the movement of a man who had survived chaos long before he ever walked into this airport. Look at him. Julian Vance breathed, stepping up beside Emma, his eyes wide with professional shock. He's not approaching the cargo doors. He's bypassing the main fuselage completely. How does he know to avoid the engine intake zones? Emma's heart hammered violently against her ribs. Julian was right. The massive jet engines, though winding down, were still creating a dangerous vacuum in the storm. Daniel was navigating the blind spots perfectly, weaving through the treacherous underbelly of the aircraft with absolute precision. Who is this man? Emma whispered to herself, the memory of her own cruel words echoing in her mind. Is this your child? What are you even doing in this terminal? She had treated him like dirt. She had looked at his faded jacket and scuffed boots and judged him unworthy of breathing her air. Now, he was the only thing standing between her and total ruin. Another flash of lightning tore across the sky. Daniel reached the landing gear. He grabbed the slick, freezing metal strut and began pulling himself up toward the emergency exterior access panel, a panel so obscure that even veteran pilots rarely knew its exact location. The wind howled, ripping at his jacket, but his grip didn't falter. Suddenly, a massive gust of wind shear slammed into the side of the aircraft. The SX-800 groaned, the tires losing their final grip on the wet asphalt. The plane lurched violently backward, sliding directly toward the red-painted fuel zone. "He's out of time!" Julian yelled, slamming his fist against the glass. Daniel reached into the panel, ripping the cover off with his bare hands. Sparks showered down onto his face, lighting up his determined, unflinching expression. Then, the lounge lights flickered and died, plunging Emma and the entire terminal into total, terrifying darkness. The darkness was absolute. When the terminal's main power grid failed, it didn't just kill the lights. It instantly silenced the massive climate control systems, leaving nothing in the VIP lounge but the terrifying, muffled roar of the hurricane tearing at the glass. Panic erupted immediately. Harrison Caldwell shouted blindly into the blackness, his voice cracking as he demanded someone locate the backup generators. Julian Hayes was cursing loudly, his phone flashlight casting erratic, violently shaking beams across the Italian marble floor as he stumbled away from the windows. Emma stood completely still. Her heart was beating so violently it felt like it might crack her ribs. She was Emma Kensington. She commanded global boardrooms. She moved markets with a single signature. She hired and fired executives before her morning coffee. But right now, standing in the pitch black as her multi-million-dollar legacy slid toward a catastrophic explosion, she was shivering. She was utterly, terrifyingly powerless, and all her wealth meant absolutely nothing. Then, a small, steady light pierced the gloom. Emma turned. It wasn't a phone screen. It was a tiny, battery-powered reading light, the kind you clip onto a paperback book. Lily was sitting exactly where her father had left her on the leather bench. The 8-year-old had clipped the small light to the collar of her dad's oversized, faded canvas jacket, which completely engulfed her small frame. She was humming a quiet, unrecognizable tune, her hands calmly folded in her lap. Emma stumbled toward the bench, her expensive heels sinking into the plush rug. She practically collapsed next to the child. The billionaire CEO was trembling, struggling to catch her breath. The little girl in the oversized jacket was perfectly still. "Aren't you scared?" Emma whispered, her voice betraying the cold steel she usually projected. She gripped the edge of the leather bench, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the seams. Lily looked up, her small face bathed in the soft yellow circle of light. She reached out with a tiny hand and gently patted Emma's arm. The gesture was so tender, so entirely unexpected from a child speaking to a stranger who had just yelled at her, that Emma felt a sudden, sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. "Dad says panic is just a rocking chair," Lily said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that cut right through the freezing tension of the room. "It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere." Emma let out a shaky breath, staring at the little girl. "Your dad, he's out there in a Category 4 storm. He's climbing a prototype aircraft he knows nothing about. The wind could throw him right off." Lily tilted her head, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Who said he doesn't know about it?" Emma frowned in the dim light. Look at him, sweetheart. He's a civilian. He doesn't have the clearance or the training to be near a machine like that." "He doesn't need clearance," Lily whispered, looking back toward the dark windows. "Dad knows all the planes. He used to fly the ones that don't have windows, the ones that go faster than sound." Emma's breath hitched. The ones that don't have windows. Experimental stealth tech? Unmanned aerial combat vehicles? Who exactly was this man she had just insulted over a spilled cup of cocoa? Before Emma could press further, a blinding, jagged fork of lightning illuminated the entire tarmac. The lounge was bathed in harsh blue-white light for 3 agonizing seconds. Emma and Julian rushed to the glass. The SX-800 was less than 10 feet from the red-painted fuel zone. But it had stopped moving. The massive turbines had ceased their deadly rotation. The dangerous whine of the auxiliary power unit was dead. Hanging by one arm from the emergency access panel, 50 feet in the air, was Daniel. He had successfully triggered the manual hydraulic lock, dropping the heavy steel anchor pins directly into the tarmac. He had done the impossible. He had killed the power and manually anchored a 200-ton jet in the middle of a hurricane. He did it. Julian gasped, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated disbelief. I don't believe it. He actually did it. A second later, the emergency backup generators kicked online. The lounge flooded with dim, amber lighting. The heavy doors at the back of the lounge banged open. 2 armed airport security officers rushed in, followed closely by Marcus Sterling, the director of terminal operations. Marcus's face was purple with rage, his expensive designer suit soaked from a leak in the outer concourse. "Who authorized a breach of those tarmac doors?" Marcus bellowed, pointing a shaking finger toward the restricted entrance. "That is a federal offense. The second that man steps back inside, I want him in handcuffs." "Nobody touches an Atheris aircraft without my explicit authorization." Emma turned, her previous fear evaporating into sudden protective fury. "Marcus, shut your mouth. That man just saved my entire company." "He breached protocol, Miss Kensington." Marcus fired back, stepping aggressively into her space. "He's a severe liability. We don't even know who he is. Look at how he's dressed. He's probably some drifter trying to rip copper wire off the landing gear in the confusion." The heavy acoustic doors from the tarmac groaned loudly. The wind howled into the lounge for a split second before the door slammed shut. Daniel stood in the entryway. He was completely drenched. Rainwater poured off his broad shoulders, pooling quickly on the expensive marble floor. His knuckles were raw, scraped to the bone, and bleeding sluggishly. He looked exhausted, but his posture was terrifyingly straight. He didn't look like a drifter. He looked like a soldier returning from a war zone. Marcus immediately marched toward him, flanked by the 2 guards. "Get on the ground, right now. Hands behind your back." Daniel didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the screaming guards. He didn't even acknowledge the weapons on their hips. He walked straight past them as if they didn't exist. He walked directly toward Emma. Marcus reached out to grab Daniel's wet shoulder. "I said get on the..." Daniel moved with terrifying speed. He didn't strike Marcus, but he shifted his weight seamlessly, catching Marcus's wrist and twisting it just enough to lock the larger man's entire body in place. The movement was so fluid, so brutally efficient that the 2 armed guards instinctively stepped back instead of drawing their weapons. Daniel released Marcus, letting the humiliated director stumble backward into a chair, and continued his path until he was standing just inches away from Emma. Emma looked up into his dark, storm-gray eyes. She expected anger. She expected him to demand a massive reward, or to yell at her for the cruel way she had treated him and his daughter. Instead, he reached into his soaked jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, scorched piece of titanium. He dropped it onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Your lead engineer is either incompetent or he was paid off, Daniel said. His voice was low, devoid of adrenaline, chillingly calm. Emma stared at the piece of metal, her blood running instantly cold. What is that? That's the primary locking shear pin from your landing strut, Daniel replied, his unwavering gaze locking onto hers. It didn't snap because of the wind. It was cut. Someone tried to make sure your plane never made it to Denver. The scorched piece of titanium sat on the glass table, heavy and undeniable. The ambient amber glow of the backup lights cast long, distorted shadows across its jagged edge. Emma stared at it, her breath completely abandoning her. She didn't need to be an aviation mechanic to understand what she was looking at. The primary shear pin of the SX-800 wasn't designed to snap under wind pressure. It was built to withstand the impact of a 200-ton aircraft hitting a runway at 150 miles an hour. The edge of the metal wasn't torn or fractured. It was perfectly, smoothly sliced. Someone had used a thermal cutter on it. "This is insane!" Marcus Sterling shouted, his voice cracking violently in the tense silence. He pointed a trembling finger at Daniel. "He's lying! He probably found that piece of scrap on the tarmac." He's a trespasser trying to justify the fact that he just committed a federal offense. Daniel didn't even look at the director. He completely ignored the furious executive, turning his broad back to the room. He walked slowly toward the leather bench where Lily was sitting. Water dripped from his canvas jacket, pooling on the expensive marble. Emma watched him, mesmerized by the sheer, quiet force of his presence. Here was a man bleeding, soaked to the bone, standing in a room full of powerful people screaming at him, and his only concern was the 8-year-old girl waiting for him. Daniel knelt in front of Lily. He didn't say a word about the storm, the multi-million-dollar plane, or the men with guns. He just gently reached out and tucked a stray lock of wet hair behind her ear. "You did good, Bug," Daniel murmured, his deep voice carrying a warmth that completely defied the freezing panic of the room. "I saw your light." Lily smiled, her small hands reaching out to hold his raw, scraped knuckles. "I kept it on so you wouldn't get lost." "I'm never lost when I can see you," Daniel replied softly. Emma felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. She had spent her entire life building walls. She had surrounded herself with wealth, security details, and ironclad contracts. But looking at the fading light in the room, she realized she had absolutely nothing that resembled the safety this man was giving his daughter. "Arrest him," Marcus shrieked, turning to the 2 security guards who were still hesitating near the door. "I am the director of terminal operations. I am giving you a direct order to put that man in handcuffs right now." The guards stepped forward, their hands resting nervously on their holsters. Emma snapped out of her trance. The cold, ruthless CEO returned in a fraction of a second. She stepped directly between the armed guards and Daniel. "If either of you takes one more step toward this man," Emma said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper, "I will personally see to it that you never work in corporate security again. And Marcus?" She turned her piercing gaze to the director. "If you don't shut your mouth, I will buy this entire terminal by morning, fire you before lunch, and spend the rest of the afternoon making sure your pension is tied up in litigation for the next 2 decades. Marcus went pale, his jaw snapping shut. Suddenly, Harrison Caldwell's satellite phone blared. In the deadened silence of the lounge, the harsh electronic ringtone made everyone jump. Harrison fumbled with the device, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "Miss Kensington?" Harrison stammered, his eyes wide with horror as he read the caller ID. It's Elias Croft." Emma's blood ran cold. Elias Croft was the ruthless venture capitalist actively trying to orchestrate the hostile takeover of Atheris Aviation. He was the man waiting for her to fail in Denver. He had no reason to be calling her personal assistant's emergency line at this exact moment, unless he already knew the plane wasn't taking off. Before Emma could grab the phone, a horrific groaning sound echoed through the walls. It wasn't thunder, it was the sound of tearing metal. Julian Vance rushed to the floor-to-ceiling windows, shining his flashlight downward. "The storm surge!" he yelled in absolute panic. "The underground retention wall just failed. The lower levels are flooding." "The backup generators are in the basement," Marcus screamed, completely losing what little composure he had left. As if on cue, the amber emergency lights flickered violently. Once. Twice. Then, The entire terminal went black again. But this time, the silence didn't last. A heavy mechanical clank echoed through the lounge, followed by the terrifying sound of thick steel deadbolts sliding into place. Julian ran to the main acoustic doors, slamming his shoulder against the heavy wood. It didn't budge. He frantically pushed the electronic exit button, but the keypad was completely dead. "The magnetic seals!" Julian cried out, his voice bordering on hysteria. When the main power and the backup fail, the VIP wing automatically goes into lockdown protocol. The fire doors just sealed us in. Panic erupted. The wind outside had reached a deafening roar, battering the massive glass windows. The structural beams of the lounge began to pop and groan under the immense pressure of the hurricane. They were trapped inside a glass box, and the storm was breaking through. Emma tried to breathe, but the air felt thin. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She commanded a global empire, but she couldn't open a single door. She looked around the pitch-black room, her eyes adjusting to the faint flashes of lightning. Her gaze landed on Lily. The little girl had finally dropped her booklight. For the first time, she looked terrified, pulling her knees to her chest as the wind howled like a freight train. Emma didn't think. The billionaire CEO, who hadn't comforted another human being in a decade, dropped to her knees on the marble floor. She crawled through the darkness until she reached the leather bench. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to pull the little girl into a hug. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Emma lied, her voice cracking horribly. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She was utterly helpless. "I promise. We're going to get out." Lily looked at Emma's shaking hands. The child didn't look comforted. She looked more scared by Emma's obvious panic. Then, a large, warm hand gently covered Emma's trembling fingers. Emma looked up. Daniel was kneeling beside her. His face was a mask of absolute, unwavering calm. He didn't look at the sealed doors. He didn't look at the screaming executives. He looked at Emma. "Breathe," Daniel commanded softly. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor. He gently moved Emma back, pulling Lily effortlessly into his arms. The child immediately buried her face in his wet jacket, her trembling stopping almost instantly. Daniel stood up. He walked toward the heavy, electronically sealed fire doors, where Marcus and Julian were hopelessly pounding against the wood. "Move," Daniel said. "It's a 10-ton magnetic lock." Marcus screamed in his face, spit flying in the dark. "It requires a biometric override and direct power. We're going to die in here." Daniel didn't argue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy, scorched titanium shear pin he had taken from the aircraft. He jammed the jagged metal edge directly into the seam of the reinforced doorframe. With a sickening crunch, he began to pry off the steel cover plate of the biometric lock, exposing the intricate, highly restricted wiring underneath. Julian stared at him in absolute shock. "How do you know the schematic for a Class 4 security terminal?" Julian's question hung in the dark, suffocating air of the VIP lounge. "How do you know the schematic for a Class 4 security terminal?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't even blink. His large, scraped hands moved with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. He dug the jagged edge of the scorched titanium shear pin into the exposed wire cluster beneath the biometric plate. He didn't hesitate to search for the right connection. He knew exactly what he was looking for. With a sharp flick of his wrist, a shower of blue sparks rained down onto the Italian marble. A heavy, metallic thud echoed through the walls. The 10-ton magnetic lock disengaged. Daniel pushed the heavy acoustic fire doors open with one shoulder. The chaotic sounds of the flooding terminal rushed in, accompanied by the eerie, rhythmic flashing of red emergency strobes from the main concourse. Marcus Sterling, the director of terminal operations, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. "That's impossible," Marcus stammered, his voice trembling. "That system is hardwired into the federal grid. You can't just bypass it with a piece of scrap metal." "It's a standard fail-safe loop," Daniel said, his voice flat, devoid of any adrenaline. He reached down and scooped Lily into his arms, pulling her tight against his chest. "Designed to keep people out, not in. Let's move." He stepped out into the pulsing red light of the hallway, leaving the billionaires and executives staring after him. Emma Kensington's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed him out. Her expensive charcoal trousers soaked up to the calves the moment she stepped into the concourse. The underground retention wall had completely given way. The lower levels were taking on water at a terrifying rate. The polished floors of the Crestview Executive Terminal were rapidly transforming into a dark, swirling river of debris. The water is rising too fast, Julian shouted over the deafening roar of the hurricane battering the glass ceiling above them. We need to get to the second-floor pedestrian bridge. No, Daniel commanded, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. He didn't yell, but the absolute authority in his tone made everyone freeze. The bridge is entirely tempered glass. The wind shear outside is hitting Category 5. If that glass blows inward, it will cut everyone on that bridge to pieces. We can't just stand here, Marcus shrieked, water splashing against his expensive designer suit. He pointed a shaking finger at Daniel. You don't know this building. I am the director. I say we go for the bridge. Before Daniel could respond, a massive, sickening crack echoed from the far end of the terminal. Everyone turned just in time to see a massive steel support beam buckle under the storm's pressure. The entire eastern wall of windows shattered inward. A horrific wall of water, glass, and wind roared into the concourse. The blast of air knocked Marcus entirely off his feet, sending him crashing into a row of luxury leather waiting chairs. Harrison Caldwell, Emma's assistant, screamed as the rushing water swept his satellite phone out of his hands and into the dark, swirling flood. Lily buried her face in Daniel's neck, a small whimper escaping her lips. Emma felt a surge of absolute terror. She was used to controlling everything. She was used to fixing disasters with a phone call, a wire transfer, a ruthlessly negotiated contract. But as she watched the black water rising toward her knees, surrounded by the deafening destruction of the terminal, her armor completely shattered. She wasn't a CEO right now. She was just a woman, freezing, terrified, and entirely powerless. We need to get her out of here, Emma yelled, her voice cracking as she rushed toward Daniel and Lily. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to pull the little girl closer, trying to offer some kind of comfort. Lily, sweetheart, it's going to be okay. I promise, it's going to be okay. But Emma's hands were shaking violently. Her eyes were wide with uncontrolled panic. Lily looked at the billionaire, sensing the raw, unfiltered terror radiating from her. The little girl began to cry, clinging harder to her father's canvas jacket. Emma pulled her hands back, a sharp, physical ache piercing her chest. She couldn't even comfort a child. All her power, all her billions, and she had absolutely nothing inside her to make this little girl feel safe. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He gently shifted Lily in his arms, resting his large, calloused hand against the back of her head. Hey, Bug, Daniel murmured, his deep voice impossibly steady, forming a protective bubble of calm amidst the screaming storm. Look at me. Lily sniffled, pulling her face away from his jacket. What's the rule about loud noises? Daniel asked softly, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the freezing water rising around them. They're just bark, no bite, Lily whispered, her lower lip trembling. That's right, Daniel said, offering her a small, completely fearless smile. It's just the sky making a fuss. We're going to go for a climb now, okay? Just like we do at the quarry. Lily nodded, her tears stopping instantly. The absolute trust in her eyes was staggering. Emma watched them, completely breathless. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing she had ever seen. This man, wearing scuffed boots and a faded jacket, possessed a kind of wealth she couldn't even comprehend. He was an absolute anchor in a world tearing itself apart. Daniel turned his fierce, storm-gray eyes to Emma. Stay right behind me. Step exactly where I step. The floor tiles are loosening in the floodwater. If you step on a sinkhole, the current will drag you under. Emma nodded mutely, her heart pounding. She didn't question him. She didn't order him around. For the first time in her adult life, she simply followed. Daniel led the group through the rising water, weaving through the flooded concourse with tactical precision. He avoided the central walkways, sticking close to the load-bearing concrete pillars. Marcus and Julian scrambled behind them, completely abandoning their corporate hierarchy, desperately trying to keep up with the man they had insulted just 20 minutes ago. They reached the heavy steel doors of the central maintenance shaft. The electronic keypad was dead. Daniel handed Lily carefully to Emma. Emma froze as the little girl wrapped her arms around her neck. The weight of the child was a sudden, terrifying responsibility. Emma held her tight, her heart breaking at how small and fragile Lily felt against her soaked jacket. Daniel stepped up to the heavy steel doors. He gripped the center seam with both hands. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his forearms strained against his wet sleeves. With a brutal, agonizing groan of metal, he physically forced the elevator doors apart, exposing the dark, empty shaft leading up to the roof access. "The service ladder is intact," Daniel said, breathing heavily. He turned back to the group. "It leads to the reinforced maintenance dome on the roof. It's above the flood line." "I'm not climbing that," Marcus yelled, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as he stared up into the dark shaft. "It's 50 feet in the dark. I'll slip." "Then drown," Daniel said coldly, offering no sympathy. Suddenly, Harrison pointed a shaking finger down the flooded hallway behind them. "Wait, look." Through the pulsing red emergency lights and the swirling water, a group of 4 men was wading toward them. They weren't airport security. They were dressed in black tactical gear, carrying heavy, waterproof equipment bags. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the logo stitched onto the shoulder of the lead man's vest. It was a private security firm, the same firm heavily contracted by Elias Croft. They weren't here to rescue anyone. They were here to make sure the SX-800 prototype was completely destroyed, and anyone who knew about the cut titanium shear pin was silenced. The lead mercenary spotted them at the elevator shaft. He reached down to his hip, drawing a heavy, suppressed weapon. "Get in the shaft," Daniel ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal pitch. He pushed Emma and Lily behind him, stepping out to block the doorway with his own body. The red emergency strobes pulsed through the rising black water, casting fractured, violently shaking shadows across the flooded concourse. The deafening roar of the hurricane tearing through the shattered glass of the terminal was completely drowned out by the heavy, rhythmic splashing of tactical boots wading toward them. Emma stood frozen, her back pressed against the cold steel of the elevator shaft. Her expensive charcoal suit was clinging to her freezing skin, but she did not care. All of her attention was focused on the small, trembling weight of 8-year-old Lily in her arms. The child buried her face into Emma's neck, her tiny hands gripping the ruined fabric of Emma's collar. For the first time in her life, the billionaire CEO was not calculating profit margins or hostile takeovers. She was silently praying for the safety of a child she had met less than an hour ago. The 4 men in black tactical gear stopped 10 feet away. The water swirled around their knees. The lead operative, a massive man with a jagged scar cutting across his jawline, raised his suppressed weapon, the laser sight cutting through the darkness and landing squarely on the center of Daniel's chest. "Miss Kensington?" The lead operative shouted over the rushing water, completely ignoring the man standing in front of her. "Elias Croft sends his regards. Your plane is effectively grounded, and your board meeting in Denver is officially missed. You are coming with us. We are going to make sure the transition of Atheros Aviation goes smoothly." Marcus Sterling, the director of terminal operations, let out a pathetic whimper, pressing himself flat against the concrete wall. Harrison Caldwell dropped his gaze, entirely paralyzed by fear. Emma's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She tightened her grip on Lily, her eyes wide with terror. Elias Croft had not just paid someone to cut the landing gear pin. He had sent a private extraction team to ensure she never made it out of this storm to fight back. Her empire was gone. But right now, looking at the lethal weapons leveled at them, she realized her life was on the line too. Daniel did not move. He stood in the doorway of the service shaft, the muddy water pooling around his scuffed work boots. He looked at the laser sight painting his faded canvas jacket, then calmly raised his dark, storm-gray eyes to the lead operative. "Lower the weapon," Daniel said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm directive that cut right through the chaos of the storm. The operative laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He stepped closer, the water splashing loudly against his tactical vest. "Listen to me very carefully, whoever you are. I don't care if you're the mechanic, the janitor, or just some unlucky drifter who got caught in the flood. Step aside right now, or I will put you in the water." Daniel did not step aside. Instead, he moved with a speed that completely defied his large frame. He did not lunge wildly. It was a blur of absolute, calculated violence. In a fraction of a second, Daniel closed the distance, stepping inside the operative's guard. His left hand struck the barrel of the suppressed rifle, pushing it off the center line, while his right hand locked onto the man's wrist with bone-crushing force. With a sickening twist, Daniel stripped the heavy weapon from the operative's grip, dropped the magazine into the swirling black water, and drove his elbow squarely into the man's chest plate. The massive operative flew backward, crashing hard into the floodwaters. The remaining three men instantly raised their weapons, the heavy metallic clatter of safeties clicking off echoing in the enclosed space. 3 laser sights painted Daniel's chest and face. Emma screamed, turning away and shielding Lily with her own body, expecting the deafening crack of gunfire. But the gunfire never came. Daniel stood perfectly still, holding the empty rifle in one hand. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He looked directly at the patch, stitched onto the shoulder of the closest mercenary. It was a silver wolf's head over a black shield. "Orion Tactical," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a lethal, commanding octave. "Override authorization, Alpha Romeo 7. Stand down." The 3 mercenaries froze as if they had been struck by lightning. The operative on the far right lowered his weapon an inch, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He raised a heavy tactical flashlight, shining the blinding beam directly into Daniel's face. The light illuminated Daniel's raw, scraped jaw, his soaking wet hair, and his unwavering predatory stare. "Drop your weapons," Daniel commanded. The men in the tactical gear looked at each other in sheer panic. Slowly, almost mechanically, all 3 men released their grips. The expensive, suppressed rifles splashed into the dark water. The lead operative gasped, struggling to his knees in the floodwater. He wiped the muddy water from his eyes and looked up at the man who had just dismantled him in less than 2 seconds. All the color drained from the mercenary's face. "Sir," the lead operative choked out, his voice completely stripped of its previous arrogance. He was trembling. We didn't know you were here." Emma slowly turned around, holding Lily tight against her chest. She stared at the mercenaries, then at Daniel. Her mind was racing, trying to process the impossible scene in front of her. These men were lethal. They were highly paid, ruthless contractors hired by Elias Croft, and they were looking at a single dad in a faded jacket with absolute, unadulterated terror. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, the words slipping out of her mouth before she could stop them. The lead operative looked at Emma, his expression a mixture of confusion and profound fear. "You don't know who he is?" "Miss Kensington, Elias Croft didn't hire us directly. He leased our contracts through the parent company." The operative swallowed hard, looking back at Daniel. "You're looking at the founder of Orion Tactical. He wrote the operational doctrine we train on. He owns the security firm, the aerospace defense patents, and half the private military contracts in this hemisphere." Marcus Sterling slid down the concrete wall, his jaw dropping open. The man he had ordered arrested, the man he had called a drifter and a trespasser, was the apex predator of their entire industry. Daniel completely ignored the stunned silence of the executives. He turned his back on the trembling mercenaries and walked straight back to Emma. The lethal, commanding aura vanished the second he looked at his daughter. He reached out, gently wiping a drop of dirty water from Lily's cheek. "Just a loud noise. Bug." Daniel murmured, his voice soft, entirely devoid of the violence that had just transpired. "Nothing to worry about." Lily gave a small, brave nod, keeping her arms wrapped tightly around Emma's neck. Emma looked at Daniel, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at his raw, bleeding knuckles, the gentle way he touched his daughter, and the absolute safety radiating from him. All her wealth, her power, and her status meant nothing. This man had hidden his empire to be a father first. "You four," Daniel said over his shoulder, his voice hardening back into steel as he addressed the mercenaries. "You work for me now. Croft is out. Form a perimeter. We are getting these people up that ladder before the entire terminal goes under." The transition in the flooded hallway was absolute. The 4 heavily armed mercenaries, who seconds ago had been ready to end their lives, now moved with frantic, terrified precision. The lead operative, water dripping from his scarred jaw, waded over to the heavy steel ladder inside the maintenance shaft and locked his arms around the base, bracing it against the surging current. "Clear a path." The operative barked at his men, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward Daniel. "Hold the perimeter. Nobody moves until the boss is up." Daniel didn't acknowledge the title. He gently guided Emma toward the ladder. She was shivering violently, her soaked charcoal suit offering zero protection against the freezing water. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely grip the rusted steel rungs. "I can't," Emma whispered, her voice fracturing. She looked up into the dark, 50-foot vertical climb. The fearless CEO who routinely destroyed corporate empires was completely paralyzed by the physical reality of her own fragility. Daniel stepped up right behind her. He didn't push. He didn't rush her. "Look at my hands, Emma," Daniel said quietly. It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken with such steady, unshakable calm, cut through the rising panic in her chest. She forced her eyes down. Daniel placed his large, scraped hands on the rungs on either side of her waist, effectively caging her in safety. "I am right beneath you," Daniel promised. "If you slip, you will not fall. I will catch you. Just climb." Emma took a shaky breath, the terror slowly ebbing away, replaced by an overwhelming, inexplicable trust. She began to climb. Daniel followed inches behind her, matching her pace perfectly, while carrying Lily effortlessly on his back, the little girl clinging to his broad shoulders like a koala. Marcus, Julian, and Harrison scrambled up the ladder after them, the fear of the rising floodwater and the terrifying mercenaries finally breaking through their corporate paralysis. They breached the heavy steel grate at the top of the shaft and collapsed onto the solid concrete floor of the rooftop maintenance dome. The space was completely enclosed, dry, and bathed in the soft green glow of a single emergency wall panel. The deafening roar of the Category 5 hurricane outside was reduced to a heavy, muffled thud against the reinforced concrete walls. Emma sat on the cold floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She was gasping for air, her expensive heels ruined, her immaculate hair plastered to her face. She looked across the dimly lit room. Marcus Sterling, the director of terminal operations, sat in the corner, staring at the floor, completely stripped of his arrogance. He looked like a deflated balloon. Harrison and Julian were huddled together, stealing terrified, awestruck glances at the man in the faded canvas jacket. Daniel wasn't resting. He knelt on the floor a few feet away, gently pulling his soaked jacket off Lily. He checked her for any scrapes, his large, lethal hands moving with impossible tenderness. He found a relatively dry spot on the sleeve of his flannel shirt and began softly drying her hair. "You did so good, Bug," Daniel murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm so proud of you." Lily smiled, leaning her head against his chest. "I wasn't scared. You were right there." Emma watched them, a physical ache tightening her throat. She had billions of dollars in offshore accounts. She owned a private fleet of jets, penthouses on 3 continents, and commanded thousands of employees. Yet, sitting in the freezing dark, she realized she was the poorest person in the room. She had built an empire of glass and steel, but she had never built anything that felt like this. No one in her life would climb into a hurricane for her. Slowly, Emma pushed herself up from the floor. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to walk over to where Daniel was kneeling. She sank back down to the concrete right beside him. Daniel paused, looking over at her. His storm gray eyes were soft, completely lacking the judgment or the harshness she deserved after the way she had spoken to him in the VIP lounge. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. A single tear slipped down her cheek, cutting through the grime on her face. "I am so incredibly sorry. The things I said to you, the way I looked at you. I was arrogant. I was cruel." "And you," she swallowed hard, gesturing to the heavy steel grate they had just climbed through. "You saved my company. You saved my life. And I don't even know your last name." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. He didn't offer a polite dismissal, but he didn't demand an apology either. "It's Vance," Daniel said quietly. "Daniel Vance. And you don't need to apologize. Fear makes people put up armor. You were just wearing yours a little tighter than most." Emma let out a shaky breath, the absolute grace of his response breaking the final wall around her heart. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently brushing against his scraped knuckles. He didn't pull away. The warmth of his skin was a stark contrast to the freezing room. Before Emma could say another word, the heavy steel grate rattled. The lead operative of the mercenary team hoisted himself up into the dome. He was completely soaked, his tactical gear dripping onto the concrete. He didn't look at Emma or the executives. He walked straight over to Daniel and dropped to one knee, keeping his head bowed in a posture of absolute submission. "Sir," the operative said, his voice tight with lingering adrenaline and fear. "The perimeter is secure. The water has capped at the 2nd level. We are safe here." Daniel didn't look up from Lily. "And the comms?" The operative reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a heavy, encrypted satellite radio. "Active, sir. Elias Croft has been hailing us for the last 10 minutes. He's expecting confirmation that the aircraft is destroyed and Miss Kensington has been detained." Marcus let out a quiet gasp from the corner of the room. Emma's blood ran cold at the mention of Croft's name. Daniel finally looked up. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating intelligence of a man who commanded an invisible army. He reached out and took the radio from the operative's hand. He pressed the transmission button. "Croft." Daniel's voice echoed in the small concrete dome, low and dangerously calm. "This is Orion Actual." The radio crackled with static for a brief second before a panicked, entirely unfamiliar voice sputtered through the speaker. Who? Who is this? Where is Bravo Team?" "Bravo Team is indefinitely reassigned," Daniel replied, his eyes briefly flicking up to meet Emma's terrified gaze. "And as of this exact moment, your contract with my firm is permanently terminated. If you ever place a hand on an Atheris aircraft again, or if you even breathe in the direction of Emma Kensington, I won't send a team to find you. I will come myself." Daniel released the button. He didn't wait for a response. He crushed the radio beneath the heel of his heavy work boot, the plastic and circuitry shattering across the concrete floor. The room fell into absolute stunned silence. Emma stared at the shattered radio, then slowly looked up at Daniel. The hostility of her corporate world had just been entirely dismantled by a man who didn't even care about money. Suddenly, a heavy, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the reinforced ceiling of the dome. It wasn't the storm. It was the unmistakable, powerful beat of twin-rotor helicopter blades cutting through the brutal winds directly above them. Someone had just landed on the roof. The deafening roar of the twin-rotor helicopter shook the thick concrete walls of the maintenance dome. Dust and loose debris rained down from the ceiling as the heavy aircraft touched down on the reinforced roof directly above them. The heavy steel access door at the top of the stairwell was violently kicked open. The storm outside had finally begun to break, the hurricane winds downgrading to a heavy, driving rain. A pair of expensive, waterproof leather boots stepped onto the top landing. Elias Croft descended the concrete stairs. He wore a pristine, custom-tailored trench coat, completely untouched by the devastation that had just ripped the airport apart. He looked down into the dimly lit dome with a smug, predatory smile. Flanking him were two massive private bodyguards. "Well, well, well," Croft's voice echoed through the cold room, dripping with arrogant satisfaction. He looked at the soaked, shivering executives huddled on the floor, his eyes finally locking onto Emma, the great Emma Kensington, the untouchable CEO of Atheris Aviation. "Look at you now, hiding in a basement like a frightened rat while your empire drowns." Emma stood up slowly. Her legs were weak, and her charcoal suit was ruined, but she kept herself positioned carefully between Croft and little Lily. "You orchestrated this, Elias," Emma said, her voice shaking with a mixture of freezing cold and pure hatred. "You paid someone to cut the shear pin on my prototype. You tried to kill me." Croft chuckled, a cold, empty sound. He waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be dramatic, Emma. It's just business. Your board meeting in Denver starts in 45 minutes. You aren't going to make it." Atheris stock is already plummeting on the rumor that the SX-800 was destroyed. "I have a transfer of ownership contract in my briefcase. Sign it right now, and I'll let you on my helicopter." Croft turned to the four heavily armed mercenaries standing in the shadows of the dome. He snapped his fingers impatiently. "What are you idiots standing around for?" Croft barked. "I pay your contracts. Secure the room, restrain her staff, and bring me the woman." None of the mercenaries moved. The lead operative, water still dripping from his scarred jaw, slowly reached down and rested his hand on the grip of his sidearm. He didn't aim it at Emma. He aimed it directly at Croft's chest. Croft froze, his smug smile faltering. "What do you think you're doing? Lower that weapon immediately." "They don't take orders from you," a deep, impossibly calm voice echoed from the shadows. Daniel stepped into the dim green glow of the emergency lights. He didn't look like a billionaire. He didn't look like a CEO. His faded canvas jacket was soaked, his flannel shirt torn, and his scraped knuckles were bleeding. But as he walked toward Croft, the sheer, undeniable authority radiating from him made the two bodyguards instinctively step backward. Croft frowned, looking Daniel up and down with absolute disgust. "Who the hell is this? Some homeless drifter you picked up in the terminal?" Daniel didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy, scorched titanium shear pin. He tossed it casually. It landed at Croft's expensive leather boots with a heavy, damning thud. "You left your fingerprints all over the sabotage, Croft," Daniel said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "You leased an Orion tactical team through a shell corporation to finish the job. But you forgot the first rule of buying an army." Croft's face lost all its color. He looked from the titanium pin to the heavily armed mercenaries, and finally to the man standing in front of him. "What rule?" Croft whispered, his arrogance entirely shattered. "Make sure you don't send them to attack the man who owns the company," Daniel replied smoothly. The lead operative stepped forward, his laser sight painting Croft's pristine trench coat. "Mr. Croft, you are speaking to Daniel Vance, founder and CEO of Orion Tactical. You are under citizen's arrest for federal corporate sabotage, attempted murder, and unauthorized deployment of a private military asset." Croft stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. He looked at Emma, then at the man in the faded jacket. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just failed to take over Aetherius Aviation, he had accidentally declared war on the most powerful private military contractor on the planet. "Detain him," Daniel ordered quietly. The mercenaries moved with brutal efficiency. Within seconds, Croft and his bodyguards were slammed against the concrete wall, their wrists bound tightly with heavy plastic zip ties. Croft was whimpering, all his wealth and power completely erased in the face of true, quiet strength. Emma watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned her gaze to Marcus Sterling, who was still cowering in the corner of the dome. "Marcus," Emma said, her voice finding its cold, commanding edge once again, "you let Croft's men into my terminal. You are fired. And when the FBI finishes with Elias, I am going to make sure they look through every single one of your bank accounts." Marcus buried his face in his hands, sobbing openly into the concrete. The heavy rain outside began to lighten, the first faint rays of morning light breaking through the cracked air vents of the dome. Daniel turned away from the executives. The lethal predator vanished instantly, replaced once again by the gentle, protective father. He walked over to where Lily was sitting on a dry crate. He knelt down, scooping the little girl into his large arms. She rested her head against his shoulder, perfectly safe, completely unharmed by the chaos. He walked over to Emma. The billionaire CEO looked up at him. She had spent her entire life building walls of money, status, and intimidation. She had thought that was what kept her safe. But looking at Daniel, she realized she had never felt truly safe a day in her life until she met him. "The storm is breaking," Daniel said softly, his storm gray eyes locking onto hers. "My extraction chopper is 3 minutes out. It's time to go home." Emma reached out. Her trembling fingers gently touched the raw, scraped skin of his knuckles. It was a terrifyingly vulnerable gesture for a woman who never let anyone close. "Thank you," Emma whispered, a fresh tear escaping her eye. "I have everything in the world, Daniel. But I didn't have anything that mattered tonight. You saved us." Daniel didn't pull away. He gently shifted Lily in his arms and used his free hand to wipe the tear from Emma's cheek. His thumb was rough, but his touch was impossibly warm. "You fought for her too, Emma," Daniel murmured, a soft, genuine smile touching his lips. "That's all that matters to me." Above them, the unmistakable roar of an Orion heavy transport chopper filled the air, coming to bring them out of the wreckage. Emma Kensington walked up the concrete stairs, not as a ruthless billionaire, but as a woman who had finally found an anchor in the storm. And as Daniel's hand rested gently against the small of her back, guiding her into the morning light, she knew her entire world had just changed forever.